The sun was already dipping below the trees by the time I reached the edge of the forest. The sky was streaked with soft pink and orange clouds, the kind that make you pause and feel small. I carried my backpack carefully over the uneven ground, the weight of it a familiar comfort. It had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the little extras that make camping bearable. A flashlight, a small first aid kit, and some maps I had printed out earlier. This trip was supposed to be a simple solo camping weekend, just me and the woods. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the endless stream of notifications, the crowd, and the constant buzz of life. The idea of being completely alone in nature, with nothing but the sound of wind and birds, was what I was craving. The forest was dense, old growth, with tall pines and oaks towering overhead. The ground was soft and thick with fallen leaves, needles, and patches of moss. Every step I took sent tiny clouds of dust and leaves drifting into the air. I could hear the steady chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or chipmunk moving through the underbrush. After about an hour of hiking, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees and over shallow streams, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the wind. The ground was flat and covered with dry leaves, perfect for pitching my tent. Nearby, a small creek babbled quietly, its water clear and cold. I set down my pack, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started putting up the tent. The poles clicked together with practiced ease, and the fabric stretched tight against the frame. The smell of fresh pine and damp earth filled the air. Setting up camp felt like a ritual to me. Simple, peaceful, grounding. Once the tent was secure, I gathered some dry wood and twigs for a fire. The forest was already dimming, shadows stretching long across the ground. The last bits of daylight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on everything. The air was cool but not cold, with a slight breeze that smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I arranged the wood carefully, starting a small pile with kindling at the center. After a few strikes, the lighter sparked and caught. A small flame flickered, then grew, casting a warm light that pushed back the darkening forest around me. The fire crackled and popped as it ate the dry wood, and I settled in close, the heat warming my hands. As I sat there, I took out a small tin of beans I had heated over the fire. The food was nothing fancy, but it tasted good after the long hike. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the feeling of being far away from everything familiar. The stars started to appear one by one, bright pinpricks in the sky above the tree line. I lay back on my sleeping bag and looked up through the gaps in the branches. The Milky Way was faint but visible, a river of stars flowing overhead. The sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. The steady chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl far off, the rustle of leaves as a light breeze blew. I felt a deep calm, the kind that only comes from being completely alone in nature. I thought about how small I was compared to this vast, old forest, and how lucky I was to be here. But as the night deepened, that calm started to shift. The wind grew stronger, making the trees creak and groan. Shadows seemed to stretch and move in ways that weren't quite right. I reminded myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, the kind of feelings that come when you're alone and tired. Still, something was off. Around midnight, I woke up from a light sleep to a noise. It was a low, scraping sound, like something dragging over the ground. I froze, heart pounding. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was nearly pitch black. My flashlight was on the ground beside me, but I didn't want to reach for it yet. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside the clearing. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't animal-like, not the usual rustle of a deer or raccoon. It sounded more mechanical or like heavy boots dragging. My mind raced. Could someone be out there? Was someone following the trail? I remembered reading about campers getting stalked or robbed in the woods. The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the clearing. The trees loomed dark and still. Nothing moved. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself that maybe it was just a branch falling or an animal, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to keep the fire going, adding dry wood to keep the light and warmth. The fire flickered against the darkness, but I kept my flashlight ready. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard a faint snap, like a twig breaking. The sound was close, too close. I swung the flashlight in that direction, heart pounding. The beam caught something, a figure standing just beyond the trees. I couldn't see clearly. The figure was partially hidden in shadow, tall and still. My mind froze. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice felt stuck. The figure didn't move. After a long moment, it turned and disappeared silently into the forest. I sat there, frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind was racing through every possible scenario. Was it someone lost? A hunter? Someone dangerous? I packed up the fire quickly, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. I stuffed my food and gear into my backpack, zipped up the tent, and slung it over my shoulder. The forest felt suddenly hostile, the darkness thicker. I started walking down the trail, flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead. My legs moved fast but carefully over roots and rocks. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road that led back to the parking lot. The moon was low, casting pale light over the open space. I could see my car's headlights in the distance, and I ran the last few hundred meters. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, heart still racing. The warmth of the car felt like a shield against the dark forest outside. Driving back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. But the road was empty, silent. That night, I realized that the forest, while beautiful and peaceful, could also be unpredictable and a little dangerous. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, they're just other people or the unknown. I didn't go back to that spot, but I still think about that night. The way the figure stood there, watching, silent and still. It was a reminder to respect the wild and be careful when you venture into it alone. But I'm glad I went, because even though it scared me, it also taught me something important about trust, awareness, and the quiet strength it takes to face fear head-on. I set out for the trip early in the morning, with the sky just starting to brighten behind the distant hills. The air was fresh, a little chilly but promising warmth later. I had packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, water bottles, a map, a compass, and some extra clothes. I was going to camp alone in the forest, in a spot I had never been to before. I wanted the silence, the escape, and the chance to be completely on my own. The drive took me through winding roads flanked by tall trees, their green leaves flickering in the morning light. The forest grew thicker the closer I got to the trailhead, a small dirt path barely wide enough for a single car. I parked, double-checked my backpack, and started walking down the trail. It was well-marked but not crowded. I didn't see many signs of people, only the usual tracks of deer and the occasional bird fluttering overhead. The forest smelled like pine and earth. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with fallen leaves and needles. The sun filtered through the branches, making patterns on the dirt. I took slow, deep breaths, feeling the tension from the city start to fade. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a creek. The sound of running water was gentle and steady. The spot seemed perfect to set up camp. I chose a flat patch of ground a little above the creek to avoid dampness and spread out my gear. Setting up the tent took some time, but it felt good to be active. I hammered the stakes into the ground and stretched the fabric tight, making sure everything was secure. With the tent up, I gathered some dry wood nearby to start a fire later. The forest floor was thick with fallen branches and pine cones, easy fuel if dry. I stacked some kindling carefully in a little fire pit I cleared of leaves and debris. I rested for a moment, leaning back against a tree and sipping water. The silence was almost total, broken only by the trickling creek and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt completely alone, but not lonely. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, walking upstream along the creek. The water was clear, cold, and refreshing. I saw tracks, probably deer and raccoon, and a few bird nests tucked high in the branches. The woods were alive with quiet signs of wildlife. I made mental notes of the landscape, where the sun would be, which paths seemed easier to follow, and where the thickest brush was. I was aware of how quickly weather could change in the mountains, so I stayed alert. Back at camp, I prepared dinner. I heated some canned beans and rice on my small stove, savoring the simple meal in the open air. As dusk settled, the sky turned pink and orange behind the trees. I sat near the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The firelight flickered over the dark shapes of the trees, and shadows stretched long on the ground. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped the tent closed. The sounds of the forest changed after dark. I heard owls hooting somewhere in the distance and the occasional snap of a twig. The wind whispered through the branches above, making the tent fabric flap gently. I lay awake for a while, feeling the cool night air on my face. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound outside the tent. It wasn't a typical animal noise. It was a heavy, slow crunching, like something big moving through the underbrush just beyond the clearing. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. I knew that animals like bears or wild boars were possible in this forest. I had packed bear spray and kept my food sealed and away from the tent. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and silence returned. I stayed still for a long time, listening carefully. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though my rest was lighter and more uneasy. The next morning, I packed a little breakfast and started exploring further up the trail. The sun was higher, and the forest felt different in daylight. Safer, more open. I found some small patches of wild berries, careful to only pick those I was sure were edible. The landscape changed slowly, with rocky outcrops rising among the trees. I climbed one to get a better view. From the top, I could see the vast forest stretching in every direction, a sea of green broken by distant rivers shining in the sunlight. After returning to camp, I decided to check the creek area more closely. Near the bank, I spotted fresh tracks in the mud. Large paw prints, unmistakably from a bear. They headed downstream toward a thick patch of brush. That explained the noise from the night before. My stomach tightened. The thought of a bear so close made me more cautious. I double-checked my food storage, making sure nothing was left near the tent. I hung the food bag from a high tree branch, well away from the campsite, as I had learned from guides. I kept my bear spray and a sturdy stick within reach. The afternoon passed quietly, and I tried to focus on the small beauty around me. The way sunlight made the creek water sparkle, the fresh green moss covering the rocks, the occasional bright feather dropped by a passing bird. As evening came, I prepared another simple meal, this time heating some soup. I sat by the fire again, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest sounds. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear through the branches. The fire made the cold air bearable. I noticed the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves more loudly now. The forest felt alive with movement, small animals foraging, the occasional distant call of a bird or mammal. Suddenly, I heard a louder noise outside the clearing, branches snapping sharply and heavy footsteps crunching through leaves. This time, it was closer than before, and the sound was deliberate. My heart pounded. I grabbed my bear spray and flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes. There was nothing visible at first, but the noise continued, moving just beyond the light's reach. I stood frozen, ready to defend myself if needed. The noise slowed, then stopped. After a few tense minutes, I decided to stay inside the tent, zipped up tight, and tried to calm my nerves. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I lay awake imagining what might have been out there. I knew fear could be as dangerous as the animals themselves. I focused on slow breathing, reminding myself I was prepared and alert. Morning came cold and gray. I packed up my camp slowly, every movement deliberate. I wanted to leave while the weather was still clear. The wind was stronger now, carrying the scent of rain. I folded my tent carefully, packed my gear, and took one last look around. The forest was peaceful in daylight, the earlier tension already fading. I followed the trail back toward the car, stepping carefully on the damp ground. I thought about the night's noises, the tracks, the signs I had seen. The forest was wild and unpredictable, but it was also alive and full of quiet beauty. When I reached the car, I felt a rush of relief. I had been out there alone, faced real uncertainty, and come through it safely. The trip had tested me, but it also reminded me how important it was to respect nature, to be cautious but not fearful, and to appreciate the simple things. The sound of running water, the rustle of leaves, the way light moves through trees. I started the engine, the car's warmth a welcome comfort. As I drove away from the forest, I glanced back through the rear window. The trees stood tall and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The forest held many secrets, some frightening, some beautiful, and it was up to those who entered it to be ready. This trip wasn't about escaping danger or finding thrills. It was about learning patience, awareness, and respect for the wild world. I was grateful for the experience, the solitude, and the chance to reconnect with something larger than myself. I left for the mountains in early September, right after quitting a job I couldn't stand anymore. I'd been pushing through 12-hour shifts in a loud warehouse, running on energy drinks and barely any sleep. I didn't even really plan the trip. I just loaded my old Ford Explorer with gear, threw in a cooler with food and water, and drove north. I wanted silence, isolation, a place where no one could reach me. I wasn't even sure how long I'd be gone. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. I figured I'd camp until I felt right again. I stopped at a gas station in a small town before heading into the range. The guy working the counter told me about a fire road that ran way up into the national forest. It wasn't on most maps, and he said it was real quiet up there. That was exactly what I wanted. I found the road about 10 miles past the edge of town. It was rough, just gravel and dirt, full of potholes and fallen branches, and it wound steeply upward for a long time. I drove slow and steady, careful not to blow a tire or scrape the bottom of the SUV. After almost an hour of bouncing up that trail, I found a small clearing just off the main path. It was surrounded by thick trees, with a shallow creek maybe 50 feet away. There were no signs anyone else had camped there for years. No garbage, no tracks, no burnt-out fire rings, just quiet and space. I parked under some trees and set up camp slowly. I wasn't in a rush. I had a 2-person tent, a folding chair, a gas burner, and a sleeping bag rated for cold nights. I unpacked a small hatchet, a flashlight, my boots, and some basic first aid gear. My phone had lost signal halfway up the fire road, but I didn't mind. I didn't bring it for anything besides maybe taking a few pictures. The first day felt good. I hiked around a little, mostly following the creek as it twisted down through the trees. The air smelled like pine and dirt and cold water. I didn't see any animals, but I found prints. Deer, raccoon, maybe a bobcat. Nothing alarming. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and there were thick ferns in patches between the trees. That night, I built a small fire and cooked a can of chili on the burner. I watched the flames and listened to the forest settle into its nighttime sounds. Crickets, a few rustlings, wind brushing through the canopy. Felt like what I'd been needing for a long time. I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I hiked farther, venturing maybe 2 miles from camp. I carried a small pack with water, a knife, and a snack, and kept track of my path carefully. I followed the creek again, then veered off toward a ridge I'd seen from my camp. I climbed it slowly and reached the top by mid-afternoon. The view was incredible. Miles of forest in every direction, the occasional glint of water in the distance. I sat on a rock for a while and just took it in. It was so quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. When I got back to camp that evening, I noticed something strange, but small. My folding chair was lying on its side. I was sure I'd left it open, set beside the fire pit. At first I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, but there hadn't been any strong gusts that day. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd bumped it and forgotten. I was alone out here, and little things seemed bigger when you didn't have someone else to brush them off with. That night, I stayed up later than the night before, poking at the fire and staring into the trees. There was a tension in my chest that hadn't been there the first night, like I was waiting for something. Couldn't place it. I kept thinking about the chair. I don't know why it got to me so much, but it stuck in my mind. Around midnight, I heard a sound out in the woods. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quick rustle, like something brushing past branches. It wasn't wind, though. It had weight. I turned off my headlamp and just sat there, listening. The fire had died down, so it was mostly dark except for a faint orange glow. The noise didn't repeat. I finally zipped myself into the tent and lay awake for a while, staring at the roof, ears straining for anything else. Nothing came. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I felt a little uneasy, but I pushed it down. I made coffee, cleaned up camp, and told myself it was just the woods playing tricks. I took another hike, shorter this time, and stayed within sight of the creek. I didn't want to go far. When I got back, I noticed something else. My hatchet was missing. I'd left it wedged in a tree stump near the tent, but now it was gone. I walked in slow circles, looking under everything. It wasn't there. I checked my SUV to see if I'd put it away without thinking. Nothing. That really got under my skin. I didn't hear anything in the night. No one creeping up, no engines or voices. But I knew I hadn't lost it. Someone had to have taken it. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, wrapped in my jacket, listening. I kept the flashlight and a knife close. The forest was still too still. Even the crickets were quiet. I kept checking behind me, scanning the shadows. I thought I saw movement once, just a flash between two trees, but it could have been my eyes. I slept inside the SUV that night, locked inside with the doors shut tight. It wasn't comfortable, but I felt safer. The next morning, I packed up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I didn't believe it. Something was wrong here. I loaded the tent, the chair, everything back into the SUV, and started down the fire road. I got maybe a mile before I saw something up ahead. Fresh tire tracks. They weren't mine. The pattern was different, and they were recent. I stopped the SUV and got out to look. The tracks turned off into a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, overgrown and hidden by brush. I stood there for a while, staring at that path, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. I didn't follow it. I got back in and kept driving. But I didn't make it far. Less than a mile down the road, I came around a bend and saw that someone had dragged a tree across the path. It wasn't huge, but it was thick enough to stop my SUV. I knew it hadn't been there before. I got out and checked it. Fresh drag marks in the dirt, still loose pine needles around it. Someone had put it there. Recently. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't drive around it, and my small hatchet, if I still had it, would have taken hours to cut through that trunk. I had a saw blade in my gear, and I started working on it, sawing slowly, sweat dripping down my back even though the air was cool. Every 10 minutes I'd stop and listen. Nothing, but I felt eyes on me. I worked for hours, hands blistering, blade dulling. Finally, I got enough of a cut through to pull it apart, just barely clearing a space wide enough to drive over the stump. I didn't stop again. I kept going until I hit pavement. When I reached town, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for a while, just breathing. I checked my phone, no messages, no calls. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what I'd say. I filled the tank, bought a hot coffee even though my hands were shaking, and drove straight through until I was home. For a while after that, I tried to forget the trip. I put my gear in storage, kept the SUV clean, didn't tell anyone the real story. I said I'd gotten bored of camping, that I was ready to work again. But I kept thinking about the chair, the missing hatchet, the tire tracks, the tree in the road, and I couldn't let go of the feeling that someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. Months passed, and I eventually replaced my gear. I started hiking again, closer to home, never too far from a trailhead. I stayed away from deep forests and forgotten fire roads. I told myself I was being careful, not paranoid. But sometimes, even now, when I walk past thick woods or hear a branch snap where it shouldn't, that old feeling creeps back in. That sense that someone's out there waiting quiet just past the trees. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person. Someone with time and patience and a reason I'll never understand. That's what still gets me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know I wasn't supposed to see them. I think that's the only reason I made it out. I remember the day clearly, even though it was years ago. The kind of day that starts off with excitement and ends with a weight on your chest you didn't expect. It was early September, the kind of time when summer's heat is slowly fading but the nights are already hinting at cold. The perfect time for camping, I thought. I had decided to spend a few days alone in the wilderness, to get away from the noise and stress of daily life. No phone, no internet, just me and the forest. I packed my backpack carefully the night before. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a small stove, water bottles, some extra clothes, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a good knife. I knew the area well enough. I had camped there before, though only with friends. This time, I wanted to try it alone. I had mapped out the spot deep inside a national forest about a 3-hour drive from my town. The road ended at a small parking area, and from there I planned to hike about 5 miles into the woods to find the perfect clearing I had scouted on a previous trip. The morning started cool and bright. I drove to the trailhead with my windows down, enjoying the fresh air and the smell of pine trees as I pulled into the parking lot. It was quiet, almost empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I strapped on my backpack and checked my gear once more before heading down the narrow trail. The hike was peaceful at first. The forest was alive with sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling with a gentle breeze, the distant call of a woodpecker. The path wound through tall trees, mostly pines and oaks, and the ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves. Every so often, I paused to look around or take a sip of water. I loved these moments, alone in the woods, where the noise of the city was replaced by nature's quiet rhythm. After about 2 hours, the trail grew steeper and narrower. I climbed a ridge and saw the valley below, where the river twisted through the trees like a silver ribbon. It was even more beautiful than I remembered. I took out my camera and snapped a few pictures, wanting to capture the feeling of being somewhere untouched. I finally reached the clearing I had planned to camp in by mid-afternoon. It was small but perfect, flat ground covered with soft grass, surrounded by tall trees on 3 sides, and a clear view of the sky. A small stream ran nearby, and I could hear the gentle trickle of water. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and away from the stream in case of rain. Then I gathered some dry wood for a fire later, stacking it neatly in a pile. By the time the sun started to lower, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer and the air cooled quickly. I started a fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the darkening sky. I cooked my dinner on the small stove, a simple meal of rice and canned beans, and ate slowly, watching the fire. The quiet was deep now, filled only by the sounds of night insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. After dinner, I laid back in my sleeping bag outside the tent, staring up at the stars. The sky was so clear that night, and the Milky Way stretched across it like a glowing path. I felt peaceful and alone, exactly what I wanted. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire and night noises. But then it became clearer footsteps, not the soft padding of small animals, but heavier, slower steps moving through the brush nearby. I froze. My heart started to beat faster. The forest, which had felt safe and calm, suddenly felt huge and unknown. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness but showed nothing. The footsteps stopped. I waited, breath held, listening. Then I heard a low rustle again, just beyond the firelight. It was coming closer. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, moving slowly, watching me. I tightened my grip on the knife at my side. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the forest could be dangerous at night. Bears, wolves, or worse, people with bad intentions. I had no cell signal here, no way to call for help if something happened. The footsteps circled the clearing now, slow and careful, never breaking into a run, just steady movement. I stayed low, trying to stay quiet, making myself as small as possible. My fire still burned, but the flames were low, barely lighting the edges of the clearing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of hiking back in the dark with an unknown presence outside terrified me more. Time stretched painfully. The footsteps moved around the clearing for what felt like an hour, but I know it was probably less. My muscles ached from holding still. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell again. I didn't dare move until the sky showed the first hint of dawn. When the sun began to rise, the forest felt less threatening. I packed quickly, still on edge, and started walking back down the trail. I didn't stop to look behind me, just kept moving as fast as I could. The hike back felt different. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept my eyes on the path, my hands ready on my knife and flashlight. When I finally reached my car, relief flooded through me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and breathed deeply. On the drive home, I kept replaying the night in my head. What was out there? A lost hiker? An animal? Someone camping nearby who didn't want to be found? I never found out, but the experience taught me to respect the wilderness in a new way, to be prepared, alert, and always ready for the unexpected. That trip was supposed to be an escape, a peaceful break. Instead, it became a lesson in caution and survival. I never camped alone again after that, but I still love the forest. Just now, I know it holds mysteries that don't need ghosts or monsters to be scary. Sometimes the unknown is enough. It started with a plan I made on a quiet Friday afternoon. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic, the endless emails and deadlines. My work had been piling up, and my head felt heavy with stress. I needed fresh air and silence, the kind of silence that only nature could give. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a few bottles of water, and basic tools like a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought a map of the area I planned to explore, a small notebook, and a pen. I had no phone signal where I was headed, so I prepared to be completely disconnected. The drive was long but calming. The city slowly dissolved behind me as I took the winding road through the hills and dense forests. I kept my windows down, letting the fresh wind blow through the car. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Birds sang overhead, and every now and then, I saw a deer or a rabbit dart across the road. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was small, tucked away at the edge of a vast forest with towering pines and oaks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was cool and fresh. I chose a flat spot away from the main path, near a slow-moving creek. The sound of the water trickling over smooth stones was peaceful and would lull me to sleep later. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows and bathing everything in warm golden light. Setting up the tent took me longer than I expected. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I was careful. I hammered the stakes into the ground with precise strikes, making sure the fabric was taut and the rainfly secured. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, along with my small pillow and a couple of extra blankets just in case the temperature dropped. I set up the stove nearby, in a cleared area away from dry leaves and twigs to avoid any fire hazard. As darkness fell, I built a small campfire. The crackling flames cast flickering light over the trees and my gear. I had gathered some dry twigs and branches earlier, and the smell of burning would mixed with the fresh scent of pine. I boiled water for my canned soup and ate slowly, savoring the warmth and quiet. After eating, I sat back on a log and just watched the stars appear one by one in the night sky. The Milky Way stretched across the blackness like a dusty band, and the silence around me was complete, except for the soft sounds of crickets and the creek. Later, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, feeling the cool night air on my face before the warmth of the bag wrapped around me. I was tired but content. As I lay there, I could hear small noises in the forest: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, an occasional bird calling far away. Nothing seemed threatening, just the normal sounds of the woods at night. I felt a peaceful kind of isolation that I hadn't experienced in years. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind moving the branches, but then I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps, maybe, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. The noise was coming from outside the tent, not very far away. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it at the tent's fabric walls, but all I could see was darkness and shadows. I tried to calm myself down. The woods were alive with animals. It was probably a deer or a raccoon looking for food. I kept the flashlight steady and listened closely. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the campfire light I had left burning low. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours after that, my flashlight in hand, ready for anything. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I refused to let fear take over. I reminded myself that this was nature, and I was just a visitor. By early morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything a soft orange. I breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The world seemed different in the daylight, less intimidating and more alive. I crawled out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of any visitors from the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing that suggested anyone had come close to my camp. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. I made breakfast using my stove to heat water for coffee and warming some oatmeal. I took my time, savoring the simple meal and the peaceful surroundings. The creek's gentle murmur was soothing, and the birds were more active now, flitting between branches and calling out to each other. I spent the morning hiking around the area. The forest was dense but inviting, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I followed narrow trails, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to examine a plant or watch an insect crawling along a leaf. I wanted to remember this place, to connect with it. I found a fallen log covered in moss and sat there for a while, feeling the rough bark beneath my fingers and listening to the sounds around me. As the day went on, I explored further but kept an eye on the time. I didn't want to be too far from camp when night came again. The forest was beautiful but unpredictable. I took pictures with my phone to capture the moment, though I knew the memories would stay with me longer than any photo. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I collected some firewood and prepared for the night. This time, I felt more confident. I arranged the wood carefully, making sure I had enough for a long fire. I cleaned my campsite, picking up any trash or leftover food. The last thing I wanted was to attract unwanted animals. The second night was colder than the first. I layered my clothes and zipped my sleeping bag tightly around me. The fire crackled loudly, casting dancing shadows on the trees. I stayed awake for a while longer, reading from my notebook by the firelight. I wrote about the day, about the peace and the quiet, about the strange feeling of being so far from everything familiar. At some point, I noticed movement at the edge of the firelight again. This time, it wasn't footsteps but something larger, maybe a deer or a small group of animals. They moved carefully, sniffing the air, probably attracted by the warmth or the smell of food. I didn't panic. I just watched quietly. The animals didn't come close to the fire and soon disappeared back into the dark forest. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down and the night sounds all around me. The third day was clear and sunny. I decided to pack up and head back home. I didn't want to push my luck by staying longer, especially alone. Breaking camp took longer than setting it up. I rolled up my sleeping bag, packed my tent, and stacked all my gear carefully in the car. I made sure I left no trace of my stay, clearing the fire pit and scattering the ashes in the creek. On my drive back, I felt different, lighter. The stress I'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't expected. The woods had tested me, with silence, isolation, and small moments of uncertainty, but I had come through without losing myself. No ghosts, no monsters, just me, the forest, and the raw truth of being alone in nature. I knew I'd come back, not because I was brave or reckless, but because this kind of peace was rare. because sometimes you need to disappear from the world for a little while to find yourself again in the quiet rustle of leaves, the slow flow of a creek, and the crackling of a fire under the stars. I had been planning the trip for a while, not because I needed a break or was stressed, but because I had always wanted to try solo camping. I liked the idea of getting away from everything, people, noise, my phone, all of it. I didn't want to sit in a tent and scroll through social media while pretending I was out in the wild. I wanted real silence, real peace, just me, my gear, and the woods. I picked a national forest in Oregon. It wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 3-hour drive, but it was remote enough that you could hike for miles and not see anyone. I did my research, bought all the necessary gear, packed light but smart, and set aside 5 days. I left on a Wednesday morning so that I'd miss any weekend hikers or families. I wanted real solitude. When I arrived, I parked at a small gravel lot at the end of a forest road. There was no ranger station there, just a faded map posted on a wooden board and a metal box for registration forms. I filled out the little slip, stuck it in the slot, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail I followed wasn't well maintained, but that was part of the appeal. It cut deep through thick pine and fir trees, past patches of ferns and moss-covered logs. The further I went, the quieter everything got. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional squirrel rustling in the underbrush, and the wind brushing against the treetops. After about 4 hours of hiking, I turned off the trail and started looking for a flat, hidden spot to set up camp. I found one near a small creek. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there were no signs of recent human activity. Felt perfect. I pitched my tent about 20 yards from the creek, under a big pine tree that offered some shelter from wind and falling debris. I built a small fire ring out of stones, gathered some dry wood, and boiled water for dinner. That night, I sat by the fire until it died down and then crawled into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent while listening to the sounds outside. The forest never really sleeps. There are always small noises, distant cracks, rustling leaves, but none of it made me uneasy. If anything, I found it calming. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, stretched my legs, had oatmeal and coffee, and spent the day exploring the area. I didn't follow any trail, just wandered carefully through the forest, marking trees with bits of orange flagging tape so I could find my way back. The terrain wasn't too steep, but it was easy to lose your sense of direction among all the trees. I saw deer tracks, lots of birds, and even a bald eagle flying overhead. Around noon, I made it back to camp, ate lunch, and then decided to sit by the creek for a while. I brought a small book but spent most of the time just watching the water flow over rocks. That second night was when I noticed something odd. I had gone to bed early, probably around 9. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't cold, I wasn't having a nightmare, and I didn't need to use the bathroom. I was just awake, wide awake, and I didn't know why. The forest was quiet, more quiet than usual. I couldn't hear the creek anymore, even though it was only a short distance away. It wasn't until I focused that I realized what was bothering me. There were no sounds at all, no insects, no owls, no wind, just stillness. I lay there, frozen, not moving or even breathing heavily. I was trying to listen for something, anything that would explain the silence. Then I heard it, a branch maybe 30 feet from my tent, snapping underfoot. Not falling from a tree, but cracking under pressure, like someone stepping on it. It wasn't a big crack, but it was clear. After that, nothing. I kept waiting for another sound, some movement, but everything went silent again. I stayed awake for hours, staring up at the roof of my tent, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I got out of the tent and walked the perimeter of my camp. Nothing was out of place. No signs of animals, no footprints, no broken branches. The only tracks I found were my own. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been nearby. Maybe a deer had wandered close and gotten spooked. That was the most logical explanation, so I tried to leave it at that. That day, I decided not to go far. I stayed around camp, chopped more wood, double-checked my gear, and did a bit of fishing in the creek. I didn't catch anything, but it helped pass the time. I had a fire again that night and stayed up a little later, keeping the flames going until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I crawled into my tent and told myself not to overthink things. That night, I woke up again. This time, I heard what sounded like light footsteps. They were slow and uneven, like someone trying to move carefully. They came from the direction of the creek. I stayed perfectly still, heart racing, ears straining to catch every sound. The footsteps came closer, maybe 10 feet away, and then stopped. I didn't hear any breathing, no movement, nothing. Just silence again. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. I lay there for what felt like hours. No more sounds came. When the light finally started to seep through the tent walls, I finally moved. When I stepped outside, the fire pit was cold. My gear was untouched. I walked in a wide circle again, checking for prints, disturbed dirt, anything. Nothing. No tracks, not even from an animal. Just quiet woods and the soft murmur of the creek. It almost made me feel like I imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I knew what I heard. By the fourth day, I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. I was constantly on edge, turning my head at every sound, second-guessing every little movement in the trees. I debated packing up early, but I told myself I had one night left and I could handle it. I didn't want to quit just because I got spooked. I spent the day gathering wood and stacking it up near the fire ring. I sharpened the small knife I kept on my belt. I didn't have a gun, but I had a flare and a whistle. I went to bed that night fully dressed, boots on, with the knife tucked into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep, not even a little. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide, heart thudding in my chest. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, methodical. This time from the opposite side, coming from the trees. Then silence. Then a single, very light scratch on the side of my tent, like a fingernail on fabric. Just once. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then nothing. I waited until the first light started to show. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I broke down camp in under 10 minutes. I didn't even roll up the tent, just stuffed it into my pack. I left the firewood, the rocks, even my book. I started walking fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The trail seemed longer on the way back. The woods felt darker, more narrow. Every sound made me flinch. A bird flying out of a bush nearly made me fall over. I didn't stop for a break. I didn't eat. I just walked, fast, non-stop, until I saw the parking lot through the trees. When I got to my car, I dropped my pack into the back seat and locked all the doors. I sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I turned on the engine and drove without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't know what to say. Nothing technically happened. I didn't see anyone. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was taken, but something was out there with me. Something that moved like a person, stayed quiet like a person, but didn't act like someone who wanted to say hello. Whoever it was had plenty of chances to make themselves known. They didn't. They watched. They waited. That's what scared me the most. A few weeks later, I read an article online about missing hikers in that forest. Not many, just a few over the years. Nothing that made headlines. The article was short, mostly about how easy it is to get lost. But one part stuck out. One of the searchers mentioned finding a campsite deep in the woods. It had been abandoned quickly, the tent left standing, firewood stacked neatly beside a cold pit. The ranger said it didn't look like the person had planned to leave, but there was no sign of a struggle. No sign of anyone, really. The name of the person wasn't released. I don't know if it was near my spot or not. The article didn't give details, but it was enough. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still go hiking sometimes, but only on busy trails, never alone, and never overnight. I think about that trip more than I want to. The silence, the slow footsteps, the scratch on the tent. Somewhere out there, someone's watching those woods. Maybe they've been doing it for years. Maybe they're still out there right now, waiting. I don't need to know why. I just know I won't be going back. I decided to go camping alone in late October, which most people wouldn't think was a good time, but I liked how quiet the forests were that time of year. No bugs, no crowds, just the sounds of wind and leaves and the dry rustle of trees shedding the last of their color. I picked a spot in western North Carolina, in the mountains near a place called Ridges Cove. It wasn't an official campground. It was a little ways off from one, a few miles in by foot, off an old trail I had hiked the year before. I took a Friday off work, packed my gear Thursday night, and left home early the next morning. The drive was long but peaceful. I had my sleeping bag, tent, a small stove, freeze-dried meals, a solar battery for charging my phone, and enough water and supplies for 3 full days. I parked at a lot near the trailhead and hiked in just before noon. The air was cool and dry, and the sunlight came through the trees in long golden angles. The leaves were mostly brown and orange, some curled and scattered on the path. Everything smelled like dry bark and distant rain. I reached the spot I had in mind by late afternoon. It was a flat patch of ground above a rocky slope, looking down into a thick forest of pine and oak. No one else was around. I pitched my tent, unrolled my bag, and set my small food stash on a boulder a few yards away. The sun dipped fast. I boiled water for a freeze-dried chili meal and sat watching the sky go from pink to steel gray. The air got cold quick, so I put on a jacket and lit a small fire with twigs and some dry bark I found near a fallen tree. That night, I heard nothing but wind through the branches. I slept well. The second day, I woke up with frost on the inside of my tent. My breath looked like smoke. I boiled water for instant coffee and sat by the fire pit, warming my hands. The woods were quiet. I decided to explore deeper into the woods past the slope. I took a small pack with water, a knife, my phone with the GPS on, and marked my camp on it just in case. I hiked down through the trees, stepping over logs and roots, moving slowly and taking note of anything unusual so I wouldn't get lost. It was beautiful, cold, silent, and still. The sun stayed low, so the shadows stretched out ahead of me. I saw deer tracks in the mud near a small stream and even found a pile of scat that looked fresh. I kept going, not too far, maybe half a mile before I turned around. I'd gone far enough to get a sense of how empty the area was. That was one of the reasons I liked going solo. No one to bother me. No yelling kids, no music, no talking. Just the sound of boots on dry leaves. When I got back, I made a fire again, warmed up some rice and beans from a pouch, and sat looking at the stars. That night, it got colder. I wore a beanie to bed and kept my jacket on inside my sleeping bag. I heard a few twigs snap in the distance while I lay there, but it didn't bother me. Could have been deer. I was used to that sound. The third morning is when something started to feel strange. I woke up with this dull headache, maybe from the cold, maybe dehydration. I drank water and sat outside to eat a granola bar. I noticed the food stash on the boulder was gone. Not scattered, gone. I had tied the bag shut and wedged it under a rock, but now it was just gone. Nothing left behind. Not even the packaging. I looked around, walked a few feet in each direction, but found nothing. No claw marks, no torn pieces, not even footprints. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself maybe a raccoon had dragged it off in the night and I just wasn't seeing the trail it left. But raccoons usually tear into stuff on the spot. Even bears usually leave scraps. This was just gone. I still had a couple meal pouches in my pack and some snacks, so I figured I'd be fine for one more night. I had planned to hike back the next day anyway, but that whole day I felt on edge. The woods weren't just quiet, they felt wrong, like the silence was too thick. I heard movement in the trees a few times, off to the side or behind me when I was collecting firewood. I never saw anything, but it didn't feel like deer. There was a stillness after each sound, like something waiting. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing far off through the trees, just beyond where the light faded. But when I blinked, they were gone. I chalked it up to nerves or maybe the cold playing tricks. I didn't go far that day, just stayed near camp, kept the fire going, and checked my phone GPS more than usual, even though I wasn't moving. I didn't want to admit I was uneasy, but I didn't want to sleep that night, but I had to. I double-checked the area, tied up the rest of my food and gear high on a tree branch, then zipped up in my bag with my headlamp beside me. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunch, then another, slow, measured. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then I heard what I swear was the sound of something sniffing, close to the tent. Just one long sniff, then silence. I stayed still, not even breathing. My knife was inside my boot near my feet, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to make any noise. The sniffing didn't return. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the sound of something walking away. Slow, calm footsteps on dry leaves, fading further and further. When the sun came up, I got out of my tent and looked around. Nothing was touched. No footprints. Nothing missing from the tree branch. But there was a smell in the air, faint, but sharp, like sweat. Not animal, human, but no sign of anyone. I started packing. I had enough. I wanted out. I rolled up the tent, packed everything into my bag, and was ready to go by 8 a.m. I checked my phone. The GPS was working. I marked my direction and started hiking back up the trail. About 30 minutes in, I saw something on the ground ahead of me. A boot print, not mine. The heel was deeper than my tread, and it was pointed toward where I had come from. Someone else had been on the trail, but going the other way. I kept walking. 10 minutes later, I saw another print, then another, and they weren't all going the same direction. Whoever it was, they had walked back and forth, like pacing. I didn't stop. I moved faster, only slowing down when I came to switchbacks. I didn't feel alone. Felt like I was being watched. That part of the forest got quiet again, almost like the day before. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots. About halfway back, the trail dipped down to cross a shallow creek. That's when I saw it. Across the water, just barely visible between two trees, was a small structure. I hadn't seen it before, and it wasn't marked on any map I had checked before coming out. It looked like an old shack or hunting blind, made of weathered wood. It had no windows, just a single door that hung slightly open. Something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't go near it. I kept going, fast. By the time I reached the parking area, my nerves were shot. My car was right where I left it. No damage, nothing missing. But as I opened the trunk and put my pack inside, I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a smear of dirt on the driver's side window. A handprint, wide, long-fingered, with dry soil pressed into the glass. It wasn't there when I left. It hadn't rained. Nothing could have smudged it by accident. I stood there, just staring at it for a long time. Then I got in and locked the doors. I drove for hours without stopping, not even for gas until the tank light came on. Even then, I picked a station near a big town. I didn't look at the woods again during the drive. When I got home, I took the car through a wash, then wiped down the windows myself. That handprint didn't come off easily. It had sunk into the pores of the glass like it had been there for years. I had to scrub it hard with cleaner and a blade before it faded. That was 6 months ago. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if someone was watching me the whole time or if I stumbled into an area they thought was theirs. Maybe that shack was a hunting hideout. Maybe not. But the food that disappeared without a trace, the sniffing outside my tent, the pacing prints, and the handprint on the glass, they all point to someone being there. The worst part is knowing how easy it would have been for them to do something worse. I was miles from help, no one around, no signal most of the time. All they had to do was wait for me to fall asleep. But they didn't. I don't think it was kindness. I think they were just watching, like I was a test, or a warning. And that's what stuck with me the most. That there are people out there who don't need to hurt you to scare you. They just need to let you know you were never alone. I took some time off in early September to get away from everything. Work had been building up for months and I hadn't taken a real break in over a year. I felt burnout, disconnected, and just tired of noise. Phones ringing, emails buzzing, traffic, crowds. I needed a place where I wouldn't hear a single engine, where I could fall asleep without headlights sweeping across my walls or people yelling outside their windows at midnight. That's how I landed on the idea of going solo camping deep in the forests of northern Montana. I picked a national forest area I'd found online, big enough to let me disappear into it for a few days. I marked out a few trails and lakes on a paper map, planned where I'd park and hike in, and packed everything I'd need to be out there for 4 days. I had my tent, food, water filter, a bear canister, emergency gear, and a GPS tracker. I even bought a new knife and a solid headlamp. I wasn't trying to take any chances. I wanted to unplug, but I still wanted to be smart about it. The drive out was long and quiet. I started early in the morning, and by early afternoon I had turned off the paved roads onto dusty logging tracks. The deeper I drove into the woods, the fewer tire tracks I saw. Eventually, I reached the small pullout where I planned to leave my car. It was nothing more than a widening in the dirt road, but it was far enough off the main routes that I was sure no one else would park there. I locked the car, slung on my pack, and started hiking. The first few hours on the trail were exactly what I wanted. Nothing but trees, the sound of the wind, and the occasional bird call. The air smelled clean, pine and moss and dry earth. I followed an old trail that barely looked used, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under sagging trees. By the time I reached a small clearing near a creek, I was sweating but satisfied. I pitched my tent under a big spruce, filtered some water from the stream, and made a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the treeline, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped into my sleeping bag early, staring through the mesh roof of my tent as the stars came out one by one. I don't remember falling asleep. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up once or twice, hearing the usual forest sounds. Twigs snapping in the distance, maybe a small animal moving around, the wind. Nothing out of the ordinary. I got up with the light and made coffee over my little camp stove. Everything felt calm. I left most of my gear at the camp and went on a long hike that day, following a game trail up a ridge to get a better view of the area. I spent hours up there, just walking and sitting and letting my mind go blank. Felt good. I didn't check my phone once. I didn't even bring it. That night, though, I started to notice little things. When I got back to camp around sunset, something felt slightly off. My tent was exactly where I left it, but my bear canister, which I'd wedged under a tree root, was moved. Not far, maybe a foot or two, but it wasn't where I'd left it. At first, I thought it had just shifted. Maybe I hadn't wedged it as tightly as I thought. But when I bent down to look, there were faint scuff marks in the dirt near it. I figured maybe a raccoon had tried to get into it and given up. Still, the lid was still locked and the canister didn't look chewed or scratched. I tried to shrug it off. Animals do weird things. That's part of camping. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up, and every gust made the trees creak. I could hear branches tapping each other high above, the distant rustle of dry leaves. But beneath that, every once in a while, I thought I heard something else, like slow crunching in the underbrush, long pauses between each step. I stayed still and listened. Whatever it wasn't close. Just somewhere out in the darkness, moving in slow, heavy steps. Not fast or frantic, just steady, quiet, and far enough away that I couldn't be sure if it was real or my imagination. I stayed awake for a long time. In the morning, I stepped out into a cold fog. Everything was damp. My tent, my pack, even my boots felt clammy. I moved slowly, making breakfast just to warm up. I walked down to the creek to refill my water, and when I came back, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. About 30 feet from my tent, off behind a fallen log, there were boot prints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine. I had only been going back and forth between the tent and the creek. These prints led in from the trees, circled behind my camp, and disappeared again into the woods. I stood there, holding my water bottle, heart thudding. The prints were faint but real, slightly deeper at the heel, like someone walking quietly, carefully. I crouched and looked closer. They were wide, like a man's and spaced evenly. Whoever made them hadn't run. They had walked right behind my tent. I looked around in every direction, but everything was quiet. The fog muffled sound made everything feel far away. I packed up most of my gear and stuffed it into my pack, just in case. I left my tent up but kept my essentials ready. I debated leaving right then, but a part of me wanted to believe it was just some other camper who wandered nearby without realizing I was there. Maybe someone got turned around in the fog. Still, I didn't go far that day. I stayed close to camp, never out of sight of my tent. I kept listening. The fog cleared by mid-morning, but the strange feeling stuck with me. Every movement in the trees made me look twice. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I lay in my bag, completely still, with my headlamp and knife beside me. I turned off my light early and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the breeze and the stream. Then, deep into the night, I heard the soft crunch of steps again. Closer this time. They moved slowly, stopping now and then. I couldn't tell where they were exactly. Maybe behind my tent again, maybe on the other side of the creek. I held my breath. The steps were too slow for a deer or bear. They were careful, like someone deliberately trying to move without sound. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Just before dawn, I finally dozed off for maybe 30 minutes. When I woke up, it was already light. I unzipped the tent and stepped out quickly, checking the area. Again, I saw more prints. Closer this time. One of them was only a few feet from my tent, near where I kept my stove and food bag. Nothing was missing, but I had the same sinking feeling in my stomach I'd had the day before. This time I didn't wait. I packed everything, fast and messy. I didn't care how I shoved things into my pack. I just wanted to move. I didn't even eat. I left the campsite and started hiking back toward my car. I didn't take breaks, didn't stop to drink. I just walked, glancing back more than I wanted to admit. The trail felt different going out. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt quiet in the wrong way. I kept seeing broken branches that looked fresh, areas of trampled underbrush, small things that might not have meant anything on their own. But when you're already paranoid, every sound feels like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made it back to my car late that afternoon. It was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing touched. I tossed my pack into the trunk, climbed in, and locked the doors before I even took a breath. The drive back out felt longer than the way in. Every turn in the road made me expect someone standing there. But I didn't see anyone. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 towns away. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. What was I going to say? That someone walked near my camp? That I heard footsteps at night? It didn't sound like much when I said it out loud. But I knew what I felt. I camped alone before many times. I knew what normal forest noises were. This wasn't that. Someone had found me out there. Someone had watched me for more than one night. They hadn't taken anything or made a sound. They hadn't left a note or a sign. They just watched. That's what scared me more than anything. It's been almost a year since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still go on hikes, still love the outdoors, but I don't sleep in the woods alone anymore. I think about that trip more often than I'd like. Not because something terrible happened, because it didn't. That's the part that gets under your skin. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a storm or an accident. It was just someone out there, choosing to stay silent, choosing to stay hidden, walking slowly behind my tent while I slept. That's what I remember when I lie awake at night. The footsteps, the quiet, and the thought that they could have done anything and chose not to. That's what still makes my skin crawl. I parked my truck on the side of a gravel pull-off just before the road turned into a narrow dirt trail. It wasn't an official camping site, but I had researched the area online for a few weeks and saw a few people mention dispersed camping being allowed up here. The place was in northern Arizona, far enough from Phoenix that I wouldn't run into crowds, but not so deep into the mountains that it felt like a survival trip. I had 2 full days off and wanted to just get away from everything. No people, no phone calls, no traffic. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, one cooler with food and water, small propane stove, flashlight, small hatchet, change of clothes, and a couple of protein bars in my backpack. I left a note on my kitchen table at home, just in case. I always did that before heading out alone. It just said the area I was headed to, the date, and that I should be back by Sunday evening. The air was warm but not hot. Late September, dry wind, no humidity. Perfect camping weather. I hiked for about 1.5 miles before I found a good flat spot under a group of tall pines. There were signs that someone else had camped there before. Flattened grass, a ring of blackened rocks used for a fire pit, but it looked like no one had been there in weeks. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some dry wood from around the site. I didn't make a fire that first night. There was a burn advisory in the area and I didn't want to risk anything. I cooked some pasta over the propane stove, ate it straight from the pot, and sipped a warm bottle of water while listening to the wind through the trees. It got dark fast. I sat in my camp chair with my flashlight propped on my lap and watched the sky turn from pale blue to deep purple, then black. The only sounds were bugs and wind. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the flap. I wasn't tired yet, but there wasn't much to do. I turned off the flashlight and just lay there on my back, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. I could hear distant creaking from the trees above, branches rubbing together. It reminded me of when I used to camp with my dad as a kid, just the two of us, out in the woods for weekends at a time. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, not heavy ones. They were light, careful, but very real. I froze and held my breath. They were close, less than 30 feet from the tent, maybe less. I didn't hear talking, just steps, then nothing, no sound at all. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes. Then I slowly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't get out, just sat there with the light off and on again, trying to decide if I'd imagined it or not. Eventually, I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. There were lots of those up here. I left the flashlight on and pointed at the flap, then lay back down. I finally fell asleep sometime near 3 a.m. The next morning, I walked around the edge of the site and found prints. Not animal ones. These were clear boot prints in the dirt and pine needles. They led down the slope, away from the tent, and disappeared into thicker brush. I knelt down and touched one of them. It hadn't rained, so the edges were sharp. Not even dry enough to flake apart when I brushed it with my fingers. Someone had been walking through my site during the night. I felt a chill climb up my spine. I looked around, trying to listen for anything, but it was dead quiet. Still, no breeze, just tall trees and open sky. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to feel like I was running from nothing. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and just kept walking. I told myself that all morning while I boiled water and made oatmeal. By noon, I felt a bit better. I hiked down to a dry stream bed I'd seen on the map, maybe half a mile away. It was full of smooth stones and fallen branches. I sat on a rock and watched birds land in the shrubs along the bank. The sun was out, and it felt good on my shoulders. I stayed there for over an hour. When I got back to camp, I noticed the cooler had been moved. It was zipped shut, but it wasn't where I left it. It was about 3 feet off to the side. No food was missing, but the lid had fresh fingerprints near the zipper. I stood there for a while, staring at it. My skin felt tight, like it was being pulled back across my body. I checked the tent. Everything was still inside. The sleeping bag was fine. My backpack was untouched. The propane stove was right where I left it. But someone had definitely come through here. I grabbed my hatchet and just stood there for a few minutes. It was the middle of the day, warm sun, blue sky, but I felt exposed, like I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight on low and sat inside the tent with the hatchet beside me. Every small sound outside made me jump. Leaves rustling, branches swaying. I heard steps again, this time slower, more careful. I didn't move. They circled the tent. I could hear them walking in a full loop. Then nothing. I waited an hour before I unzipped the flap and poked my head out. There was no one there. I got maybe an hour of sleep, tops. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up everything as quickly as I could. I stuffed the sleeping bag into the sack without rolling it. I grabbed my cooler and stove and shoved them into the backpack. I didn't eat, didn't clean up the site. I just wanted to be gone. As I started down the trail, I heard something up ahead, a stick snapping, then another. I froze. There was a person standing about 60 feet away, just off the side of the path. They weren't walking, they were standing still, facing me. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I saw that they were wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. No gear, no backpack, no visible weapon, but something about their stance sent a wave of panic through me. They didn't move. I turned around and started walking the other way, fast. I didn't run, not yet. I just walked as quickly as I could back up the trail, heart slamming in my chest. The trail looped around a hill, and I cut through the trees to shave off time. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I didn't want to be on that trail anymore. I tripped over a root and scraped my knee, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I could see the road where my truck was parked. I dropped my gear beside it, pulled out the keys, and got inside. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice. Once I got the engine started, I backed up so fast I nearly went into a ditch. I got back on the main road and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't report it. There was no actual crime, no threat, no words spoken, just prints, moved gear, and a stranger watching me. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the hoodie, just standing still in the trees, waiting, watching. It's been over a year since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still visit trails, but I don't sleep outside anymore. A month ago, I looked up news stories from that area. There was a small article, buried in a local site, about a man's truck found abandoned not far from the same forest road. No sign of him. His gear was still in the bed of the truck. The article said they didn't suspect foul play, but the search was still ongoing. I don't know if it was the same guy. I don't know if he saw what I saw, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that if I hadn't left that morning, if I had stayed just one more day, I might not have made it back either. It started with a plan I made on a quiet Friday afternoon. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic, the endless emails and deadlines. My work had been piling up, and my head felt heavy with stress. I needed fresh air and silence, the kind of silence that only nature could give. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a few bottles of water, and basic tools like a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought a map of the area I planned to explore, a small notebook, and a pen. I had no phone signal where I was headed, so I prepared to be completely disconnected. The drive was long but calming. The city slowly dissolved behind me as I took the winding road through the hills and dense forests. I kept my windows down, letting the fresh wind blow through the car. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Birds sang overhead, and every now and then, I saw a deer or a rabbit dart across the road. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was small, tucked away at the edge of a vast forest with towering pines and oaks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was cool and fresh. I chose a flat spot away from the main path, near a slow-moving creek. The sound of the water trickling over smooth stones was peaceful and would lull me to sleep later. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows and bathing everything in warm golden light. Setting up the tent took me longer than I expected. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I was careful. I hammered the stakes into the ground with precise strikes, making sure the fabric was taut and the rainfly secured. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, along with my small pillow and a couple of extra blankets just in case the temperature dropped. I set up the stove nearby, in a cleared area away from dry leaves and twigs to avoid any fire hazard. As darkness fell, I built a small campfire. The crackling flames cast flickering light over the trees and my gear. I had gathered some dry twigs and branches earlier, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh scent of pine. I boiled water for my canned soup and ate slowly, savoring the warmth and quiet. After eating, I sat back on a log and just watched the stars appear one by one in the night sky. The Milky Way stretched across the blackness like a dusty band, and the silence around me was complete, except for the soft sounds of crickets and the creek. Later, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, feeling the cool night air on my face before the warmth of the bag wrapped around me. I was tired but content. As I lay there, I could hear small noises in the forest, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, an occasional bird calling far away. Nothing seemed threatening, just the normal sounds of the woods at night. I felt a peaceful kind of isolation that I hadn't experienced in years. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind moving the branches, but then I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps, maybe, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. The noise was coming from outside the tent, not very far away. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it at the tent's fabric walls, but all I could see was darkness and shadows. I tried to calm myself down. The woods were alive with animals. It was probably a deer or a raccoon looking for food. I kept the flashlight steady and listened closely. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the campfire light I had left burning low. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours after that, my flashlight in hand, ready for anything. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I refused to let fear take over. I reminded myself that this was nature, and I was just a visitor. By early morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything a soft orange. I breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The world seemed different in the daylight, less intimidating and more alive. I crawled out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of any visitors from the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing that suggested anyone had come close to my camp. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. I made breakfast using my stove to heat water for coffee and warming some oatmeal. I took my time, savoring the simple meal and the peaceful surroundings. The creek's gentle murmur was soothing, and the birds were more active now, flitting between branches and calling out to each other. I spent the morning hiking around the area. The forest was dense but inviting, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I followed narrow trails, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to examine a plant or watch an insect crawling along a leaf. I wanted to remember this place, to connect with it. I found a fallen log covered in moss and sat there for a while, feeling the rough bark beneath my fingers and listening to the sounds around me. As the day went on, I explored further but kept an eye on the time. I didn't want to be too far from camp when night came again. The forest was beautiful but unpredictable. I took pictures with my phone to capture the moment, though I knew the memories would stay with me longer than any photo. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I collected some firewood and prepared for the night. This time, I felt more confident. I arranged the wood carefully, making sure I had enough for a long fire. I cleaned my campsite, picking up any trash or leftover food. The last thing I wanted was to attract unwanted animals. The second night was colder than the first. I layered my clothes and zipped my sleeping bag tightly around me. The fire crackled loudly, casting dancing shadows on the trees. I stayed awake for a while longer, reading from my notebook by the firelight. I wrote about the day, about the peace and the quiet, about the strange feeling of being so far from everything familiar. At some point, I noticed movement at the edge of the firelight again. This time, it wasn't footsteps but something larger, maybe a deer or a small group of animals. They moved carefully, sniffing the air, probably attracted by the warmth or the smell of food. I didn't panic. I just watched quietly. The animals didn't come close to the fire and soon disappeared back into the dark forest. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down and the night sounds all around me. The third day was clear and sunny. I decided to pack up and head back home. I didn't want to push my luck by staying longer, especially alone. Breaking camp took longer than setting it up. I rolled up my sleeping bag, packed my tent, and stacked all my gear carefully in the car. I made sure I left no trace of my stay, clearing the fire pit and scattering the ashes in the creek. On my drive back, I felt different, lighter. The stress I'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't expected. The woods had tested me, with silence, isolation, and small moments of uncertainty. But I had come through without losing myself. No ghosts, no monsters, just me, the forest, and the raw truth of being alone in nature. I knew I'd come back, not because I was brave or reckless, but because this kind of peace was rare. Because sometimes you need to disappear from the world for a little while to find yourself again in the quiet rustle of leaves, the slow flow of a creek, and the crackling of a fire under the stars. I had been planning that solo camping trip for a while. After months of sitting in an office with artificial lights and recycled air, I needed something that felt real. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and I wanted to feel small under the sky again. I'd been out camping alone before, a few times in my 20s and early 30s, but now at 38, I felt like I had to prove to myself I could still do it. I wasn't trying to go off-grid forever or anything dramatic. I just wanted a few days in the woods where no one could bother me. I chose a remote national forest area in northern Montana. I didn't want a campground with kids riding bikes or people playing music. I wanted complete stillness. I found a stretch of public land near a small, shallow lake that looked untouched based on satellite maps. The nearest dirt road ended almost 2 miles from the lake, and there were no trails leading to it. It looked perfect. I spent a couple of weeks gathering gear. I double-checked my pack list several times: tent, food, water filter, GPS, knife, fire starter, med kit, bear spray, even extra batteries for the headlamp. I didn't want to take chances. I told my brother where I'd be and left him a map with coordinates. I planned to be gone for 5 nights. The drive out was long. I left just after dawn and reached the dirt road by mid-afternoon. The road was rough, full of washouts and sharp turns, and by the time I pulled over and parked on the shoulder, I already felt far away from everything. No cell service, just tall pines, thick underbrush, and air that smelled like sap and old rain. I locked the truck, slung on my pack, and started walking. The hike to the lake wasn't easy. The forest was dense, and I had to push through tangles of branches and fallen logs. I was sweating hard within minutes. I stopped a few times to check the GPS and make sure I was heading the right way. The sun filtered through the trees in patches, and every now and then I'd hear the flutter of birds taking off or the crack of a branch under something's foot. Maybe a deer. I didn't see another person the whole way. When I finally reached the lake, it was even better than I'd imagined. The water was calm and clear, with lilies floating near the shore. I couldn't hear a single human sound. I picked a flat spot a few yards back from the water and set up my tent. It was mid-evening by the time I got my fire going and cooked some food. I sat on a log and watched the sky turn orange, then purple, then black. I could see more stars than I'd seen in years. The silence was total. It was exactly what I'd wanted. The first night passed without much happening. I woke a few times to the sound of wind through the trees or small rustlings in the brush, normal forest sounds. My tent held up fine, and the air was cool but not cold. I boiled water in the morning, had instant oatmeal, and took my time exploring around the lake. I didn't see any footprints or signs that people had ever been there. I felt like I'd found a place no one else knew about. That second day, I hiked to a nearby ridge just to get some elevation and check out the surroundings. It gave me a better sense of how isolated I really was. I couldn't see any buildings, power lines, or roads, just layers of green hills and a long stretch of trees going on forever. I stayed up there for an hour, eating jerky and trail mix, then made my way back to camp. Everything still felt good. That night, I started noticing little things. Just before bed, I heard a sharp cracking sound from the far side of the lake, not like a branch falling on its own. This was quick and deliberate, like something heavy had stepped wrong. I froze and waited. There was no follow-up sound, just that single snap. I sat by the fire a little longer, looking out over the dark water, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A bear maybe, or a moose. something wild but not interested in me. I kept the bear spray close and slept with my knife near my hand. The third day felt slightly off. I couldn't really explain it, but something had changed. I felt watched. I checked the shoreline, walked the length of it, and looked for tracks, but found nothing. No broken branches or prints or anything. Still, every now and then I turned fast, thinking something was behind me. My skin felt prickly, and I kept scanning the woods. I made myself a fire early and sat by it most of the afternoon. That night I didn't sleep much. The forest felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I heard something again, more movement near the far side of the lake. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't random either. It had rhythm, like footsteps, not fast, not heavy, but steady. I sat up in the tent and gripped my knife. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. I didn't want to use the flashlight and give away my position. I just sat there in the dark, breathing slow and listening. The steps faded eventually, and I must have dozed off near dawn. By morning, I felt shaken. I told myself it was all in my head, just the isolation getting to me. I forced myself to go through the motions, breakfast, boiling water, checking gear, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking into the trees. I packed a day bag and went for a long hike inland, hoping the movement and effort would wear off the nerves. It helped a little, but even miles away from camp, I felt off balance, like something unseen was nearby. When I returned in the late afternoon, something was wrong. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones around it were knocked slightly out of place, and there were fresh scratches in the dirt. Nothing had been taken. My food was still tied in the bear bag, untouched, but someone had been there. I stood still for a long time, just looking at the mess. My gut turned cold. I went through the rest of my gear. Everything inside the tent was how I left it. The water filter, the pack, the extra clothes, nothing had been moved. It wasn't an animal. The scratches in the dirt had a pattern to them, like someone had poked around with a stick or a knife. I stared at them, trying to picture who would come out this far, find my camp, and just mess with the fire pit without taking anything. That night was the worst. I built a bigger fire than usual and sat with my back against a tree, facing the lake. I didn't go in the tent. I didn't sleep. I held the knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other and waited. Around midnight, I heard the steps again, this time closer. They moved slowly along the edge of the lake, just past where the firelight reached. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the distinct sound of feet shifting in dry leaves. Not an animal, too deliberate. Then they stopped. No splash, no retreating steps, just silence. I stayed frozen like that until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up. I didn't cook breakfast or boil water. I jammed everything into the pack, took down the tent without folding it right, and hiked out. I kept checking behind me as I walked. I didn't stop for water or snacks. I just moved as fast as I could through the woods, following the GPS until I finally saw my truck through the trees. When I reached it, the relief hit hard. I threw the pack in the bed and got in without even brushing off the mud. I started the engine and turned around on that narrow dirt road with my heart pounding. I didn't relax until I was on the highway with bars on my phone again. I pulled over in the next town and sat in a gas station parking lot, just breathing. I didn't tell anyone the full story. When people asked how the trip went, I said it was fine but cut short because of the weather. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't sound paranoid. There was no proof, nothing taken, no photos, just a fire pit moved slightly, strange footsteps, and a constant feeling that something was just out of sight. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, but only during the day and only on marked trails. I tried going back to the woods once, just a small local park. But the first time a branch snapped in the distance, I felt my chest tighten and had to turn back. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was someone who found me out there, watched me, and didn't leave a trace. Someone who wanted me to know they were there, but not why. And that's what still keeps me up sometimes. Not knowing what they wanted, only that they were real.